So here we have it once more, the theater of American political narcissism playing out on the streets of Portland, where a president who couldn't locate truth with both hands and a search warrant has declared that a city is burning to the ground, when the most incendiary thing happening there is the rhetoric emanating from his own fevered imagination. The man stood on the White House lawn and proclaimed Portland was burning down to the ground at a time when video evidence showed empty streets and passing cars, with marathon runners jogging peacefully past the very ice facility he claimed was under siege. This is not governance. This is not even competent propaganda. This is the unhinged raving of a man who believes reality is whatever he declares it to be at any given moment. What we're witnessing is a president who, having had his attempt to deploy Oregon's National Guard blocked by a federal judge, simply circumvented the ruling by importing troops from California and Texas, as though the Constitution were merely a suggestion and judicial orders were items on a buffet from which he could pick and choose. The breathtaking contempt for the rule of law is matched only by the cynicism of the operation itself. Federal officers, flanked by professional videographers in high-visibility vests and accompanied by drones, pushed protesters down city streets and fired tear gas, flashbangs, and pepper balls without any clear signs of provocation. This wasn't law enforcement, it was performance art, designed to manufacture the very chaos it purported to be suppressing. Let us be precise about what has actually occurred in Portland. Portland police made 25 arrests over a 2-week period in June, after which protests subsided enough that the dedicated police team was deactivated. We're not talking about Fallujah here. We're talking about a manageable civic disturbance that local authorities were handling with professional competence. But that wouldn't do, would it? Because Trump needs his war zones, he needs his domestic terrorists, he needs his burning cities to justify his authoritarian impulses and to feed the paranoid fantasies of his political base. The judge who temporarily blocked the deployment, one must note with some satisfaction, was a Trump appointee. U.S. District Judge Karen Immergut found that protests since July were generally limited to fewer than 30 people and were largely sedate, and that the city's police force was trained in crowd management. Even she could see through this charade. She noted with admirable judicial restraint that the Trump administration's arguments, if accepted, risk blurring the line between civil and military federal power to the detriment of the nation. Quite so. What we have here is the deliberate erosion of the Posse Comitatus Act, that quaint notion that military forces shouldn't be used for domestic law enforcement in a democracy. The script is numbingly familiar by now. Trump's own press secretary referred to violent mob members who night after night are ravaging the community, when the actual evidence suggests something closer to routine protest activity that occasionally crosses into civil disobedience. But why let facts interfere with a good narrative? The administration needed Portland to be a hellscape, so a hellscape it became in their telling, regardless of what anyone living there might have to say about it. One must admire the calculated nature of this provocation. Local officials repeatedly warned residents not to take the bait, describing the federal presence as an attempt to goad residents into confrontation that would give the president a pretext for military crackdown. They could see it coming from miles away, this transparent attempt to engineer the very disorder that would justify the deployment. And what happened? Hours after Judge Immergut blocked the deployment, federal officers escalated their tactics, systematically pushing crowds for 15 minutes before dropping tear gas at protesters' feet and legs. If you can't get your insurrection naturally, manufacture one with chemical weapons. The residents of Portland, meanwhile, find themselves cast as extras in someone else's authoritarian fantasy. A local resident living within 1,000 feet of the ICE facility said that contrary to the president's depiction of constant violent lawlessness, most of the time there is little to see. But what does she know? She only lives there. Trump and Fox News, that marriage of convenience between demagoguery and corporate media profit, have determined that Portland is a war zone, and so a war zone it must be, facts and local testimony notwithstanding. What makes this particularly grotesque is the obvious calculation behind it. Trump first began floating the idea of a Portland deployment on the same day that Fox News aired a story mixing recent footage with older footage of downtown rioting. Think about that for a moment. The President of the United States bases military deployment decisions on a cable news segment that deliberately conflates timelines to create a false narrative. The man takes his intelligence briefings from cable news, formulates policy based on selectively edited propaganda, and then acts surprised when reality fails to conform to his television-mediated hallucinations. This is governance by channel surfing, policy-making by remote control. He admitted as much when he mused aloud, "I didn't know that was still going on," after watching Fox's deceptive montage. Of course it wasn't still going on in the way they presented it, but why should that matter? The spectacle was what counted, the permission structure for authoritarianism dressed up as breaking news. This is how republics die, not with jackboots and midnight arrests alone, but with a president who cannot distinguish between edited television footage and actual events, who sees no problem with this confusion, and who commands military force based on his media consumption habits. We've reached the point where the feedback loop between Fox News and the White House has become so tight, so incestuous, that policy is being made in real-time response to propaganda designed to influence that very policy-making. It's a closed circuit of manipulation where cause and effect have merged into an indistinguishable blur. The protesters themselves represent that inconvenient thing called actual democracy in action. Families with grandparents and children on bikes filled the streets alongside longtime protesters, engaged in bucket drumming and chanting during demonstrations that were described as raucous but largely free of confrontation. These are not domestic terrorists. These are citizens exercising their constitutional rights. But in Trump's America, dissent equals terrorism, protest equals insurrection, and any gathering that doesn't feature red hats and obsequious applause is evidence of anarchy requiring military intervention. The state's district attorney, in his court filing, found himself in the surreal position of having to argue that graffiti on the side of immigration buildings does not prevent ICE agents from performing their duties, that we've reached the point where spray paint is being cited as justification for deploying the National Guard tells you everything you need to know about the intellectual bankruptcy of this administration's arguments. And what of the comparison to Los Angeles? A federal judge in California ruled that the Trump administration broke the law when it deployed thousands of federalized National Guard soldiers and Marines to suppress protests, with Judge Immergut noting that incidents in Portland were categorically different from the violence that had occurred in Los Angeles. So even by the degraded standards of Trump's previous overreach, this Portland deployment represented a new low. The whole sordid affair reeks of that particular combination of authoritarianism and incompetence that has become this administration's hallmark. You want to crack down on dissent, but you're too lazy or too stupid to manufacture a plausible pretext, so you simply lie about what's happening, deploy troops anyway when judges rule against you, and then have your jackbooted federal agents create the disorder you claimed already existed. It's circular reasoning with tear gas canisters. Portland may survive this, as it has weathered previous attempts to use it as a political prop. But survival is not guaranteed, and it depends entirely on whether Americans beyond Oregon's borders wake up to what is being normalized before their eyes. The damage to democratic norms, the acceptance of military deployment against civilian populations, the casual disregard for judicial authority, these wounds will prove fatal if left untended. Judge Immergut warned that deployment of the National Guard had the potential to inflame protests and said any deployment would be an injury to Oregon's sovereignty. She understood what Trump either cannot grasp or does not care about, that in a democracy you don't send in the troops because you don't like how people are exercising their rights. But her warning means nothing if the rest of the country treats this as merely Portland's problem, some distant municipal squabble, rather than a test case for how far a president can go in treating American cities as occupied territories. If we imagine this can't happen elsewhere, that it's somehow contained to the peculiarities of one liberal West Coast city, then we're already lost. Portland's crisis is America's crisis, and the Republic will only endure if enough citizens recognize the assault for what it is before it's too late. But then, we've long since established that Trump's relationship with democracy is purely transactional. It's useful when it delivers him power, disposable when it constrains him. The Constitution is a suggestion. Judges are obstacles to be circumvented, and reality itself is negotiable. Portland isn't burning, but the Republic's founding principles are taking heavy damage. And that, I suspect, is rather the point.